listen, Dr. James Mueke, thanks for making it work to speak today. I think this is a conversation that I have been longing to have for some time with you or someone like you. It's on a topic that's really near and dear to my heart. And it's something that you've been advocating, especially during your time as the Australian of the Year, which you were named 2020 Australian of the Year. And so I'm keen to find out about all of that and see how that year was for you and what you learnt and how you kind of grew as a person and how your brain, your thinking, your planning, your acting may have reshaped during that time.
Yeah, it's been a big year, Dean. Thanks for reaching out and thanks for including me in your podcast this morning. I'm very happy to be here.
Pleasure. We came about, I sent you a message because you're an ophthalmologist, an eye surgeon, and I have this protocol I utilize with my clients that is highly effective at reversing metabolic syndrome and dealing with the issues of hyperinsulinemia, primarily brought out because of too much sugar, basically. People are just eating dessert all through the day. And I've had some reports from some of my clients that their eyesight has improved. They're not requiring their glasses as much. And given your area expertise, I'm like, how does this work? You know, I think that was the first kind of time I reached out to you and we started, generating our conversations. Exactly. But why don't you say a little bit about, your background as a medical doctor?
Sure. How long have we got?
Oh, as long as you want. You're Dr. James Mueke. You can take all the time you want, mate.
Yeah, it's a long story. It's hard to know where to start. But yeah, no, I was just over a year ago when I received the award. I wasn't expecting to win the award, of course, because the year before there was another Adelaide doctor that received the award. So really it was a bit of a surprise when they called out my name, but a lovely surprise. And I won the award because of the work that I have done for many, many years, fighting blindness in poor communities and setting up my charitable organisation called Sight for All back in 2007. And that's been a labour of love. It's just been, an all-consuming passion. And as you say, I'm an eye surgeon and I've been in this world for over 30 years now. And so for all that period of time, I've been dealing with the consequences that diabetes can inflict on the eyes. And what I've noticed over those 30 odd years is that I'm seeing more and more patients every year who are losing vision. Some patients even going blind due to their disease. And of course, the majority of diabetes is due to type 2 diabetes. So this is just something that I'm noticing or have been noticing in my own practice, how many patients I'm now needing to treat with this, what I call a largely avoidable dietary disease. So when I received the award for South Australian of the Year in late 2019, I was talking about in my acceptance speech, we need to raise awareness of the fact that diabetes is the leading cause of blindness amongst working age adults in this country. So that's a pretty important thing, I believe. I mean, it's why is this happening? We have about 1.7 million people in Australia with diabetes, and more than half, probably well over half, are not having their regular all-important sight-saving eye checks, and that's why it's become such a blinding problem in our society. So yes, that was my goal. I wanted to raise awareness of this important fact and encourage people to have their eyes checked. And in fact, that's what Sight for All have been doing for many years in mainstream and Aboriginal communities here in Australia. So obviously not successfully if we're still having this major problem. So it seemed to be a great opportunity to raise awareness of the work that Sight for All was doing, not just our work fighting blindness in poor countries, particularly in Asia, which is home to half the world's blind adults and 2/3 of the world's blind kids, but also here in Australia, and as I mentioned, in Aboriginal and mainstream communities, particularly in lower socioeconomic areas. So this was my sort of drive. And then going forward to the national ceremony on the Australia Day weekend 2020, just over a year ago, I thought about it more deeply and I thought, well, this is Australian of the Year. I'm a doctor, have a really critical health issue in this country. And for the last year, we've been dealing with this COVID-19 pandemic. We've lost around about or close to 1,000 lives, which is a tragedy, of course. But in the same period of time, we've lost in the order of 15 times more lives. So roughly 15,000 deaths due to type 2 diabetes over the past year. So this is a silent pandemic that people, it's really going unrecognized, unnoticed, certainly unheralded. And so what I thought was important for me to do was to raise awareness of this really important issue, and also the root cause of type 2 diabetes, which is our poor diet, and particularly a diet, as you mentioned, which is high in sugar, high in refined carbohydrates, and high in ultra-processed foods, which in itself is high in sugar and refined carbohydrates, and also the seed oils, which have an added danger component to them. So yeah, so this is what I've been doing for the last year. I've taken on this almighty battle, because it is a huge, heavily conflicted territory. And so I've had a big year, a little stressful year, but a challenging and absolutely fascinating year, which I've embraced. And despite the COVID pandemic, I've been putting my heart and soul into trying to raise awareness, amongst the many other things that I've been doing for the past year.
Yeah, good on you. Well, thank you. It's like a topic that's even more pertinent today, given the suppression of the immune system due to the poor diet. And gosh, it was, and we're not just talking about the obesity epidemic. Obviously, obesity is a major risk factor for the development of type 2 diabetes. And even if people just lose a little bit of weight, 10% loss of total body mass, that's an equivalent risk reduction of like 60 to 70% of developing type 2 diabetes. So, however, doctors are putting patients on anti-diabetic medications, high, cholesterol lowering medications, high blood pressure medications all the time. And these are normal weight patients. So it's not just limited to those who are obese. It's
Absolutely. In fact, there's a really interesting statistic. There are now more thin, metabolically unhealthy people in the United States than there are overweight or obese, metabolically unhealthy people. And I suspect the same situation here in Australia, and perhaps even globally. I mean, it's obesity is not the main issue here. It's, as you say, it's a risk factor. It's actually the leading risk factor for type 2 diabetes, but it's not everything. In fact, it's not even the number of calories that we're consuming. It's actually the type of calories, and particularly the sugar component, and particularly the fructose component of sugar, which is so toxic to our bodies.
Yeah, I was just explaining to someone yesterday, there was this study done where they took people who had a stable weight over a probably a 3-year period, and they worked out what was the total protein and carbohydrate content they were consuming, and they kept that steady, and they gradually increased the total daily calorie intake via fat. And they exceeded 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 calories. They maxed out at 6,800 calories. And these people did not gain weight. They didn't put fat on. Now, if they increased their carbohydrate content more and stimulated more insulin release, then there would have been greater fat deposition. But that kind of flies in the face of what we've all been taught over the past 40 years. So when I take on clients and I tell them it's not your fault. You're fighting against, like, if they're obese, that you're fighting against thousands of years of evolution. The body was designed to put fat on, wasn't designed to take it off so readily. When you eat a certain diet, and there's been a good 40 years at least of misinformation. So why don't we jump straight into that, because that's the elephant in the room. What's the misinformation? What have we all been hoodwinked by? What have we gotten wrong? What are the truths that we traffic in that are just killing us?
Yeah, it's a fascinating area. You asked earlier, my journey through the past year has been an extraordinary journey of learning and mentorship. People have reached out to me to really to guide me through this whole process, because it is extraordinary, the backstory to this. And just very briefly, you mentioned 40 years ago something happened which made us change. It probably dates back certainly at least to World War II, and in the decades after World War II, when it was noticed that there was a rise in heart attacks. And it was thought that this rise in heart attacks was due to a fatty diet causing fatty blockage of our coronary arteries. So it just made sense at the time that that was the causation. So basically the recommendation was to reduce the fat in our diet to stop this happening. And this was based on no strong science whatsoever. In fact, it was based on conflicted science. And there's a bigger story to that as well. But just to cut a long story short, when the Dietary Guidelines for Americans was released in 1980, the recommendation was to reduce our dietary intake of fat to 30% and increase our carbs to 60, 70%. And what happened then, rather than see a downturn in heart attacks took off, and along with it, type 2 diabetes. And so in the past 40 years since that time, we've seen a 4-fold increase in type 2 diabetes globally. And this has actually been even more profound in some communities and countries. In China, for example, there's been more than a 10-fold increase in type 2 diabetes in that time period. In Aboriginal communities in Australia, at least an 80-fold increase in type 2 diabetes. Something terribly, terribly disturbing. You know, type 2 diabetes was almost non-existent back in the 60s. And we're now seeing about 250 new cases in Australia every single day. We're now seeing it in children as well, as children as young as 7. This was a disease that used to be called maturity onset diabetes. We're seeing it in kids. We now have over 1,100 children in this country, 40,000 young adults with type 2 diabetes. It is deeply disturbing what's going on.
It's unreal. You know, my interest in diabetes really stemmed from, I guess, you know, as young as I can remember. My older brother, who was 9 years my senior, type 1 diabetic. And I just saw the challenge that was. I mean, the daily injections, but more importantly, the sporadic hypoglycemic fits, the episodes, the dramatic mood changes, and the impact that had on the family as a whole. I mean, there was a period of time where we shared a bedroom. I can't remember how old I was, maybe 10, 11 or something. And he had a nocturnal hypoglycemic fit. And, you know, I heard him and he fell out of the bed, and I jumped down out of my sort of loft bed, and I couldn't find anything to put in his mouth to stop him from biting his tongue. And I just stuck my hand in his mouth, and he was clamping down on my fingers. I thought I was going to lose my fingers, and I was just screaming to my parents to get some honey. And, you know, so I learned from a very young age the impact of sugar and the understanding of blood sugar levels and insulin, et cetera. And I think that's very much drove my interest in really learning about, you know, cell metabolism and regulation of metabolism. And it always struck me, it's like, that's type 1 diabetes. My brother didn't really have a say in any of that. Now, the end complications of diabetes are the same between type 1 and type 2. And if you've got a choice, why the heck would you make lifestyle choices that lead you down to that kind of freaking life? It just never made sense to me. And there's got to be some kind of environmental condition in which people are living. Otherwise, if we're informed, if we knew what we were doing, I just can't imagine that people would actually make those kind of lifestyle choices.
Absolutely. I think awareness is a huge, huge part of this. To me, there's 3 overarching strategies. Awareness is one, accountability of businesses and industry to do the right thing by the people of this country, if we're talking in Australia, and also assistance. So there are 3 really key factors here. But going back to the environment and you know, people's choice and lifestyle, you know, there are a number of factors that make it a really difficult thing to minimize our intake of sugar, particularly. And I came up, you know, a year ago, leading up to the Australia Day ceremony, I was thinking about it, as I said, quite deeply, and I came up with this strategy that I call the 5 A's of sugar toxicity.
Yeah, I love it.
I think, you know, still a year later, that in my mind, it works pretty well. My whole thought process has broadened quite dramatically, but I still like to talk about these 5 A's of sugar toxicity because it then makes you understand why it is such a problem. First one is addiction. So sugar is highly addictive. It's been shown to be as addictive as nicotine. So its consumption activates a reward center in our brains, leading to the release of the neurotransmitter dopamine. And that's what makes us feel good when we have sugar. It's what makes us want to do it again. And it's what gives us those cravings. And if anyone's tried to detox from sugar, it's a really tough, unpleasant thing to do. So, when you have those mid-afternoon sort of lags, it's often your body calling out for sugar, and once you detox from sugar, you don't have those cravings, which are so tough. Second A is alleviation. We often use sugar to alleviate stress or to make us feel better when we're down. So when we're stressed, the body is flooded with the stress hormone cortisol. So the brain needs to balance that up by the release of feel-good chemicals such as dopamine. And of course, sugar does a really good job of triggering that. Third A is accessibility. Our world is absolutely flooded with sugary products. You can't walk into most service stations without being confronted by a wall of confectionery. And you can't check out from most supermarkets and stores without being enticed by half-price soft drinks and chocolates. Preying on people's addictions, preying on the vulnerable, preying on our kids as well.
Let's just stop there for a second, because those three are huge. I mean, you've said these 5 A's many hundreds of times, right? For people listening to this, it may be the very first time they've ever heard it. So if we just go back, the addictive nature of sugar, I mean, that's clear. You just tell someone to cut sugar out of their diet and see how well they go. They turn into criminals in their own homes, like sneaking into the kitchen, looking for the chocolate. It's like, they'll be just sneaking little bits here and there. It really turn into a criminal just cutting it out. So it's highly addictive. And then it alleviates stress, you said. And one of the things that I say, it's not just sugar. Sugar's the culprit, but fat is the accomplice. And when we have them together, that nutrient combination, which is rarely seen in nature, by the way, you rarely ever see fat and sugar together, but you do in milk. And that addictive behavior towards feeding is appropriate for an infant when on the boob, but then we wean off the boob, and they kept feeding us dairy and bastardizations of that. So this thing never grew up. So we've got this juvenile brain trying to manage this adult aging body now. And when times are stressed, we turn to those things to kind of console ourselves, those foods, right? People call it comfort eating, emotional eating, whatever they call it, nurture feeding, more like it. And then what was the third A you said? Accessibility. Now, I say to people, you come to my place, you check out my fridge, my cupboards, or whatever, you won't find junk food. Why? Because I don't buy it. Why don't I buy it? Because I don't freaking trust myself. If I have it here, I'm going to eat it.
Absolutely.
It's like, I don't have the kind of strong will or anything like that. I have a brain that evolved just like everybody else's over thousands of years to be addicted to this sort of stuff. So I'm responsible for not having it in my environment.
That's right. And that's absolutely the situation. I'm exactly the same as you, Dean. If there's ice cream in the fridge, and then you're talking about that combination of sugar and fat, and the ice cream manufacturers have nailed it. I mean, that is my favorite. That is my weakness. If there's ice cream in the fridge, I got to tell you,
James, I knew before he passed away, Ron Street. So his father started Street's ice cream, right? And we're having lunch, and I turned to him and I said, so he was 92 years of age at that time. And I said to him, so tell me about your career, right? Because this guy invented the paddle pop, right? Ice cream on a stick. He didn't invent ice cream on a stick, but he invented the paddle pop, right? And
genius.
I know, right? And he's a aeronautical engineer, and he was supposed to go on a fellowship to the United States and be a rocket scientist, but I think his partner didn't want to leave Australia, so he stayed and he worked in the family business. And for something to do, he developed the paddle pop, right?
Wow.
And I said, it was a fascinating story. And I said to him, tell me, what is the most technologically advanced ice cream on the market today? I've never seen a 92-year-old man light up and start talking to me about the Magnum and all the technical aspects that make it such a genius product. Right?
Wow. Because it's got a combination of chocolate and ice cream.
Totally. But what it did is it made me realize how much intellectual effort goes into the development of these products to get us hooked, to have us enjoy such an amazing experience. So we keep chasing that buzz over and over and over again and make ourselves feel special when we consume them. I mean, really smart people. We're talking about a rocket scientist came up with the stuff that made us fat. It's just, that's what it takes. That's the level of genius it takes.
It's so true, isn't it? And as I say, if there's rarely been a day in my years where I haven't had ice cream. You know, in the last year, since I've become more aware of how addictive it is, I didn't realize. No, here I am. I'm a doctor. I'm treating the end-stage complications of this dietary disease. You know, blinding dietary disease. And I wasn't aware of how addictive sugar was. You know, I was addicted to sugar. I love my ice cream, and I just was a sucker to this. In fact, I found out about a year ago now, actually, that I have a fatty liver, and the fatty liver is sort of central to this whole process. And if you can see me, I'm tall and thin. You know, I had no idea I was metabolically unhealthy, so I got a bit of a shock a year ago. But as I was saying, you know, if I've got ice cream in the fridge, it's in my stomach. If there's chocolate in the house, forget it. You know, it's we have to protect people's environment. So for me, I see it as a physical dependency, and I don't feel I'm deeply psychologically addicted to sugary foods. It's a physical dependency, and that is borne out when you try and detox. You get the withdrawal symptoms, and they're very real and they're very powerful. Headache, irritability, fatigue, clouded thoughts. You know, they're very real, and they literally, for me, start on day one, and then the cravings come along and they're intense. And for me, it was a 3-day process just to detox from the obviously heavily sugared products, and not even going to the next level. So it's a real struggle to detox from sugar. So in a sense, it's actually better not to have these heavily sugared products in your environment. So starting with the house, no ice cream in the fridge, no chocolate in the pantry, get rid of all the ultra processed foods and confectionery and jams and condiments and sauces, which are full of sugar. So you can start by clearing out those products from your immediate environment. But then the minute you walk out of the house, there are ads at the bus stops. The bus goes past with ads for sugary products. You go to the supermarket and you can't escape the 2-for-1. You know, it's just calling out to you all the time. And you know, go to the supermarket and you're at the checkout and there's a 2-for-1 chocolate. And I know I've done this myself. I've bought both chocolates, and by the time I got home, I've eaten both for the price of one. And before I've got home, it's just so powerful. So, you know, we need this then comes down to the strategy. Maybe we should go back to talking about.
There are certain supermarkets, major supermarkets, I rarely go to. Because again, just like the design of these ice creams and these food products and candy bars, etc., the supermarket environment itself is designed to make me buy stuff I don't want, I don't need, that's going to kill me. And, you know, I'm just smart enough not to go to those supermarkets. I'll go to the local little greengrocer. Yes, it's a little bit more expensive, but I don't buy as much. You know, and I don't buy all the ancillary crap that I ordinarily wouldn't have bought, these impulse things. Especially, don't bring your kids to the supermarket. Oh my God. That's
it's a nightmare.
You know, don't go to the supermarket when you're hungry.
That's why all the confectionery and stuff is at kids' eye line, because you know, they know that when the kids screaming out to the parents to get them a chocolate in the queue at the checkout, parents often do it just to shut the kid out. And it's really hard as a parent. It's really tough as a parent when you're faced with that sort of situation. Better to avoid it. And so to avoid those supermarkets where they are quite literally, and I believe criminally, preying on people's addiction, it is absolutely best to avoid those businesses. But it's becoming harder and harder to avoid those businesses because, you know, these days, post offices, office supply stores, school supply stores, they're all doing it. It's
James, medical centers have
pharmacies.
The candy bowl. It's unbelievable. I mean, you know, and I deal with doctors all the time, and I even have doctors who have requested my support in dealing with their own health. Terrible, terrible people to coach. doctors are the worst because you know too much, right?
Or maybe they don't know enough, because myself as a medical student never received any education, any exposure to nutrition or nutrition science. My son's just finished, last year was in second year medicine, and he had the opportunity to do nutrition as an elective. So it's not even taught in medical school, and yet this is the single biggest driver. Our poor diet is responsible for more disease and death than alcohol, smoking, and inactivity combined. And yet, so it's the biggest driver of chronic disease, the biggest cause of death. And yet, as doctors, we're not being taught about it. That is criminal as well.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Well, you know, the fourth A, awareness.
Fourth A, no.
No? Have I jumped something? What have I missed? What did I get wrong?
So the fourth A is addition, you know, the astronomical amount of sugar that's added to our food and drinks. So something like 75% of our food and drinks have added sugar. And there are 56 common names for sugar. So again, it's, you know, if you look at those nutritional labels on the packets of foodstuffs, I can barely read them these days, let alone understand them. And they do not tell you what the added sugar content is. So that's one thing. So then you have all of these names, 56 common names for sugar. There are actually more, but 56 common names for sugar. So that when people look at the packet, even if they try and interpret, they're not aware of what the
I tell you what was funny. So a colleague of mine, older, overweight, goes in a hospital dealing with a kidney stone, and then subsequent to that has a heart attack. So he recovers, thank goodness, and he's a scientific colleague. He's a biochemist, and we're sitting there in a cafe, and I said to him, dude, you got to stop eating so much sugar. And he said to me, Dean, I don't eat sugar. And I said, tell me, what did you eat for breakfast today? He had muesli and fruit and yogurt, right? And I said, dude, it's like still having the same impact on your insulin levels. This is a biochemist. And he's like, oh yeah, didn't think of that.
Yeah. So if the most highly educated people in our society are not aware, then what about everyone else? I mean, it's disturbing. That's why awareness is such a critical thing, that there's so much sugar in our environment. So that addition, you know, there is this health star rating system, which is flawed. There's only about 30% of manufacturers actually use the health star rating system.
How many? 37.
Sorry, only 30% of
30%
manufacturers use the health star rating system. So because it's voluntary, it's flawed. You know,
yes.
Quite simply, you know, who's going to put an unhealthy rating on something they're trying to market and sell? But also it's flawed because there are a number of inherently unhealthy products which get a healthy rating. So orange juice, until a month or so ago, received 5 stars, and yet a glass of orange juice, I'm glad you're not drinking orange juice there. Water, good on you. A glass of orange juice has almost as much sugar as a glass of cola. But recently it's been downgraded to 2 stars. But there also are other products which get a healthy rating, and there's a whole number of them. But this is a device that's been created by industry for industry, so it's certainly not. It's not truly trying to tell us what the unhealthy products are. So we've been kind of deceived by this health star rating system, which is an industry tool. So that's another thing with the addition. You know, if we actually have a health star rating system which is flawed, then how are we going to be directed towards the right choices? And then the other thing which really aligns with that is the fifth A, which is advertising. So once again, you know, our world, not only is it flooded with sugary products, but it's flooded with ads and TV commercials for sugary products. You know, again, as I say, you can't walk out the door without just seeing it. And once you actually see it, it's really hard to unsee it. Once you see it, it's everywhere. It's just popping up on your TV, in the newspaper, magazines, social media, bus stops, buses, government buildings, you name it. It's just everywhere, and it makes it so difficult to avoid. So those are the 5 A's of sugar toxicity.
Yeah, goodness, and it really is toxic. I mean, you know, glucose toxicity, sugar toxicity. It glycates our proteins, so you end up with these advanced glycation end products. I remember gosh, when was that? 2002. It seems like I was just a kid. I was 25 and I was in New York, and I met with Anne-Marie Schmidt at Columbia University, and she was studying advanced glycation end products and their impact on cardiovascular disease back then. Like, it was so new and innovative, and it was like, what is this? Why the heck would we evolve receptors on the surface of our cells for advanced glycation end products that we call affectionately RAGE, receptors for advanced glycation end products? So when age binds to RAGE, it sets off this downstream cascade of biochemical events that results in tissue degradation, inflammation, accelerated aging. And I think that's what's happening, right, in the micro vessels of the eye when people who have high blood sugar levels for a long period of time, it really damages the microvasculature. Is that what's happening in the eye and like a lot of these patients?
Absolutely. So there's a number of the biochemistry and the pathophysiology is quite complex, and perhaps we don't need to delve too deeply into that. You've touched on a little bit of it, but just if we're looking simply at the eye and the blinding complications of diabetes, so there's two kind of key things that it can do. It can damage the blood vessel walls, making them leaky, and so you get leakage of fluid out of those blood vessels into the tissue of the retina. And when it develops and when it accumulates at the central vision area, what we call the macula, then the vision starts to become blurry and distorted, and that's what's called diabetic macular edema. So that is one vision-threatening complication of diabetes. The other is you can get blockage of the retinal blood vessels, and when you get blockage, you get a ischemia, a lack of oxygen flow. That in itself can be damaging, but it can also trigger the ingrowth into the eye of abnormal blood vessels, in essence trying to heal the ischemic areas. And those blood vessels are fragile, and they can bleed suddenly. And I often use the example of one of my patients who went to bed at the age of 50 with normal sight and woke up the next morning blind in both eyes due to his type 2 diabetes. He is still blind to this day. He's also had his left leg amputated almost a year ago to the day. In fact, it was his 9th amputation in a 14-month period up until a year ago. So he's also had 2 heart attacks. So here's a person who's been devastated by type 2 diabetes and its complications. And he wasn't aware. At the age of 16, when he first started earning money, he was drinking 4 liters of Coke per day over a 10-year period when he developed type 2 diabetes at the age of 26. And when he developed, he wasn't aware how addicted he was to sugary drinks, and sugary drinks are particularly dangerous. And he also wasn't aware when he developed type 2 diabetes of what was in store for him. He really didn't know. And this is why coming back to awareness is so critical. So we're jumping around a little bit here, but with awareness, there's several elements to it. That one, type 2 diabetes is preventable. 2, that it is potentially reversible as well. Most people aren't aware of how toxic sugar is, and particularly the fructose element. So that's why those 5 A's of sugar toxicity to me are really important. People are also not aware that the dietary advice that we've been given for the last 40 years, which is based on that recommendation by the American Dietary Guidelines, our Australian Dietary Guidelines still to this day use the same low-fat, high-carbohydrate model that was recommended 40 years ago. So, this awareness factor is so critical in this process.
Now, even those so the average health consumer turns to a certain cohort of people for expert advice, right? And, some of these are highly trained. I had a dietitian around my place. It looked like he was doing some innovative stuff in the community. I thought, wow, I want to foster that. I want to partner him. And he is, and I love what he's doing. But this is someone with 2 master's degrees in dietetics. He works extensively in the clinical environment here in Sydney, supporting a number of doctors in the nutritional treatment of their patients, so-called. And where in my living room having a conversation about the basic biology of how these diseases progress. I mean, you look at the Diabetes Australia website and it says, we don't know how type 2 diabetes comes about. Come on, we do. You got to cut that crap out. It's just, you can't plead ignorant anymore. That's just disgusting as far as I'm concerned, given the enormous impact on people's lives. And I'm having this conversation with this guy. I'm talking about the biochemistry and the pathophysiology and the real potential of pancreatic beta cells that have de-differentiated due to glucose toxicity, due to the inflammation, due to oxidative damage because of high triglycerides. If you handle that biochemical environment of the cells, they can re-differentiate and become glucose sensitive insulin secreting cells again. And this is a guy, he's sitting there, and I said to him, it looks like you've got your back up a little bit. I don't want you to get defensive with me. And he kind of shook it off and he goes, yeah, I'm getting a bit defensive. He goes, we just never learnt this stuff, Dean.
No.
And I'm thinking, what did you learn? How to sell packaged foods? I mean, talk to me about this stuff, because this really irks me, James. What's been your experience? Because I have my own views. I don't know how politically correct I could, contain myself, but let me let you speak.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the other thing that we kind of know, I mean, I think everyone knows that saturated fat is bad for us. It's something we've been told for 40 years because, again, coming back to our guidelines, it continues to discourage saturated fat, including natural saturated fat. And yet there's no evidence to show that the natural saturated fat in foods such as eggs, full fat dairy, unprocessed meat, even dark chocolate, have never been linked to cardiovascular disease. So this is, again, an awareness. This is such a critical thing. So fat, and particularly saturated fat, natural saturated fat, has a reasonably benign effect on the body, relative to sugar. So when we take sugar in, I'm not saying that we should overindulge in fat, because it can result in weight gain for sure. There's no doubt about that. But the really bad guy here is the sugar, and as I mentioned before, particularly that fructose element. So when we take sugar in, and if we look at table sugar, for example, which is 50-50 glucose and fructose, then as soon as the glucose from sugar is taken into the body, insulin is released immediately to try and move that glucose into our cells. So like many things that glucose in excess, and if it's can be toxic, as you said, the glycation end products and so forth. So the body immediately triggers a release of insulin to deal with that, to actually reduce the glucose in the bloodstream, because it's dangerous to our cells. But particularly the fructose element. So when fructose is actually absorbed into the bloodstream, unlike glucose, which triggers the release of insulin, fructose is not actually recognized as a food by the body. It doesn't trigger the release of insulin. It actually suppresses our appetite control system. And when it's absorbed into the bloodstream, 100% is taken up by the liver. And I think something like a third of it is turned immediately into fat. So it's much more dangerous. Also, some of the metabolic byproducts of fructose metabolism in the liver can result in insulin resistance. So it's actually a very toxic element. And I mentioned before my fatty liver. Fatty liver is central to this process. Insulin resistance is central to this process. And so the fact that sugar is converted into fat is really important to know. Most people don't realize that when they're having a 2-litre bottle of soft drink, that a significant proportion of that is actually turned into fat. And when we have developed insulin resistance, and again, we can sort of talk about the deeper biochemistry here, but one of the central things here is a fatty liver. So with prolonged and excessive glucose intake and fructose intake, the liver eventually starts to take on that fat. So we develop a fatty liver. And in humans, we can actually develop a fatty liver within a couple of months with excessive fructose intake. And once the liver becomes full of fat, it gets to a point where it won't take on any more fat. And that fat is then exported away as triglyceride. And in addition to what you mentioned before, the high blood sugar level, which has its damaging effects through glycation end products, it's the high triglyceride level in the blood combined with a high insulin level, which can result in the formation of fatty plaques. And it's those things that block the blood vessels and cause some of the really horrendous, life-changing and life-threatening complications of type 2 diabetes. Some of the major threats, such as amputation, which I mentioned before with that patient, but also heart attacks and strokes. 80% of patients with type 2 will ultimately succumb to a heart attack or stroke. So this is a deadly disease. So it's a high blood sugar level, and it's a high triglyceride level in the blood, and it's really the small LDL particles which are the culprit here, but also combined with a high insulin level. And interestingly, insulin is a hormone which promotes weight gain. And yet we are giving insulin to patients with type 2 diabetes. And as soon as they go on insulin, patients with type 2 diabetes will now put on more weight. And
yeah.
It's extraordinary that we're using medications to reduce blood sugar. And high blood sugar level is actually only a symptom of the disease. And the disease actually starts way before we even detect a rise in blood sugar level.
But hang on a second, doctors and dietitians so a GP will refer a type 2 diabetic to a dietitian to help manage their diet. The dietitian will tell them to continue to consume carbohydrates. And as major food groups, I have a client, took a little bit to get her on board because her GP was reluctant to let me work with her. I needed him to remove one of the medications from her drug regime, which finally he did. We had a conversation. He kind of went, wow, this is a fascinating approach. I'm willing to do that. Let's trial it for 4 months. And he took the medication off. In a 4-year period with a long list of medications, they've never been able to get a BGL, blood glucose levels, below 11.5. Within 3 weeks, she had 2 hypos on this protocol, this nutritional protocol. She felt fine. It's just her BGLs dropped below, it was at 4.0. And she was not even hypoglycemic. She was just concerned about it. So she spoke to the diabetic educator who said, you need to include more carbohydrates in your diet. And I said to her, she came, thank goodness she didn't listen. And she called me first. And I said, no, go back to your diabetic educator and make an appointment to your GP and request that your insulin dose, because she was taking exogenous insulin, be reduced. It's like, why would you continue putting the poison back in that made you sick in the first place? I mean, it's just, none of it makes sense.
Yes. And I actually had a patient yesterday who I was having this discussion with about putting their diabetes into remission using a low carbohydrate diet. And he'd been to his endocrinologist who was encouraging more carbohydrate to as you say, rather than reducing the insulin level, they should be having more carbs. This is people who are carbohydrate intolerant, and the endocrinologist is actually telling them to have more carbs. It just makes no sense. It's just unbelievable, isn't it?
What do we do, James? Because, you've got a voice, you've got a platform. I speak to preventative cardiologists who tell me, Dean, it's going to be hard for cardiologists to work with you because, that's just not how they run their business. They have expensive consultation fees and they overdiagnose with angiography. And then I speak to gastroenterologists whose practices are run by dietitians. And then I speak to an well-known endocrinologist who I love, and I think he's amazing, says to me, Dean, by the time a patient comes to me, they want pharmacology. And I'm like, no patient wants pharmacology. What are you talking about? You want pharmacology for them. Like, what do we do here?
Yeah, it's often easier.
I want the answers.
It's big, it's huge, and it's heavily conflicted by industry and also religious ideology. There's all sorts of things that make this really difficult beyond the sort of A's of sugar toxicity. So, the awareness factor is important. And the awareness, not just amongst patients of the addictive nature of sugar, the fact that we're using it to alleviate stress, the fact that there's so much sugar in foods in our environment. So this awareness is important, but we also need awareness in starting in medical school, or actually starting in children's. There should be education at schools. Certainly for doctors, we need education starting in medical school, and we need education of the parents. I mean, I've never seen on free-to-air TV anything to raise awareness of the dangers of excessive sugar intake. Nothing. We still see ads, discouraging smoking, which is very important. We still see ads for motor vehicle accidents to belt up, but we see nothing ever about the dangers of sugar and ultra-processed foods. So this is a critical thing that needs to happen.
And that's where most people's education comes from when it comes to food and nutrition, is advertising.
Absolutely. That's right. Absolutely. So the other thing that needs to change is the dietary guidelines, and the review process is about to start, but it's going to be 3 years. In the meantime, we might have 3 times 15,000 deaths, up to 50,000 deaths in the next 3 years until the dietary guidelines come out. There's about 100,000 new diagnoses every year for type 2 diabetes. So we can have another 300,000 people diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. So the awareness needs to start now. And I've been pleading with the Department of Health, we need to do this while we wait for the dietary guidelines to be revised. But we need a complete macronutrient shift in the dietary guidelines. They've got to stop demonizing natural saturated fats, which have never been linked to cardiovascular disease. And they've got to stop encouraging the eatings of cereals and grains, which have been linked to cardiovascular disease. It just needs a whole complete reworking. But it's that in itself is going to be a battle, because there are going to be people on that committee and those working groups who are wanting to keep encouraging the eating of cereals and grains. And so that in itself needs to change. And hopefully I've applied to be a part of that group. Hopefully I'll be a part of that expert advisory group overseeing that process, so that is such an important document. It's actually really powerful, because it informs what's eaten at schools, childcare, aged care, prison, the services, the armed services, also in hospitals. As you mentioned, what's served in hospitals is a high carb dietary pattern. To people who've just had their legs amputated, it's the very thing they should not be consuming. But it also informs health educators, health practitioners, health policy makers, and the food industry. So quite literally, thousands of low-fat products have been created on the back of this low-fat dietary recommendation, which still is implicit in our dietary guidelines. So this is really important. Now we come back to those overarching areas. So I talked about awareness, accountability, and assistance. So accountability is the second. So yes, this is where we need the government to step in to hold businesses and industry accountable for their predatory marketing and sales tactics, which I mentioned before, with the half-price chocolates at checkout counters. That's a sort of thing that should be banned, and is being banned in a number of communities around the country. We've talked about, no, we didn't talk about a levy on sugary products, but that's something that is one of many strategies. It was the one strategy a year ago that all the press were focused on. Dr. Mueke calls for a sugar tax, but actually it's just one of many, many strategies. Yep. Also, the advertising of sugary products in our environment, the government needs to pull that back. So accountability is one thing, sorry, the second thing. And then the third thing is assistance. So this is assistance. So for example, to patients with metabolic dysfunction, and 2/3 of Australian adults and 1/3 of Australian kids are overweight or obese. So the majority of us are metabolically unhealthy. The majority of us are not healthy.
So this is clearly a conditional thing, because if that number of people are unwell, you can't say then it's a lack of education, understanding, willpower, responsibility of the individual. I mean, when the president of the Australian Medical Association himself was dealing with some issues of metabolic syndrome and had to handle that. I mean, and you're saying that one of the key early stages of disease progression is what's happening in the liver and fatty liver, and 1/3 of Australian adults are at risk of that. And there's no drug treatment for that. Sorry?
2/3.
2/3.
And 1/3.
At risk. And there's no pharmacological treatment for fatty liver disease. It needs to be treated nutritionally. I mean, it's a nutritional problem. It needs to be dealt with through diet as well.
Absolutely. And we know that there are over 100 controlled clinical trials saying that type 2 diabetes can be put into remission and there are a number of, there are three ways that we can put type 2 diabetes into remission. One is surgery, what we call bariatric surgery. But to me, why would you perform major abdominal surgery on a healthy, normal organ for what is a dietary disease. So we surely should be taking a dietary approach to this dietary disease.
And that's only for those who are so obese that it's appropriate for. And, we were just saying that there's more, you said it, at least in the United States, there's more skinny fat people, right? Metabolic syndrome, normal weight patients than there are overweight patients. So yes. Bariatric surgery isn't the answer.
No, bariatric surgery. And it's also risky. Major abdominal surgery, it's expensive. Why would you go there? So there's two dietary approaches which have been shown to put type 2 diabetes into remission. One is a very low calorie diet. There's been shown in a study in the UK. This is an 800 calorie a day dietary intake, which to me is absolutely not sustainable. It demands a lifelong dependency on willpower. It's not nutritionally satisfactory. I wouldn't be encouraging this. The thing that I think, or the dietary approach which is sustainable, is a low carb diet, and there are so many studies now.
That's what is unique about the approach that I take, because I use both. So I put people on a calorie, because when you put people on a very low calorie diet, there are some key gene expression changes that happen that are more conducive towards longevity than compared to the same degree of calorie deficit by eating just a little bit less and including exercise. We know that calorie restriction is even more beneficial, but this is only until the metabolic derangement is corrected. When I work with a doctor and you say, yeah, their blood chemistry is a beautiful, Dean, I'll transition them out of that calorie restricted dietary phase. Do you get what I'm saying? It's not forever.
Absolutely.
And at the same time, I calorie restrict, but I also carbohydrate restrict. So I'm handling the biochemical dysfunction as well, and giving the pancreas a bit of a break from, as you say, the sugar toxicity.
Yes, the approach you're taking, Dean, is absolutely spot on. And the other thing I'm sure you also possibly do in your practice is time restricted eating or intermittent fasting. And
to a degree, it actually happens naturally. It's amazing what happens. So generally, people have their evening meal as the last meal of the day, and then they're pretty much fasting, and they get the same immune regenerative effects of intermittent fasting, because they're not really they'll have a bit of protein to break the fast first thing in the morning to prevent the risk of going into a hypoglycemic state. But the body becomes more and more, it adapts, it becomes more and more efficient at utilizing not just the ketones as a fuel source. So you get what we call ketone adaptation, but also the liver and the kidneys become more efficient at utilizing amino acids as a fuel source, converting that into glucose that the brain, adrenal medulla, and the red blood cells need through gluconeogenesis. But amino acids can also be converted into ketones as well. So the body adapts. You just got to give it the right time and the right nutritional environment to create those adaptations. And then even when they've lost the weight, I keep them on a stabilization program when they have the freedom of choice. I still have a bit of structure in there. I just don't trust them with their body yet. There's a certain degree of maturity and discipline that needs to be developed over time, not because of anything about them as an individual human being, but more the environment that we live in. It's like when you've got the freedom of choice and you get thrown back into this giant candy store, it's like, wow, I've got to hold people. And you say assist. This is why I love your approach, right? And what you speak of, it's so in line, parallel, in sync with what I'm doing. And it's not like I hold their hand, but I'm there to guide them and ensure that they don't fall off the wagon, they don't bounce back, they don't, and they discover for themselves that they can trust themselves in this environment. And they can not only trust themselves to stay well, but they can contribute to the improved nutrition and well-being of their own children, their family, the people they love and care about. And there's got to be that kind of community stand for one another, not just a doctor talking to a sick patient. It's got to be this overall accountability. And I think as health consumers, it's got to start here. We can't be waiting for the government to sort themselves out or the medical association to sort themselves out or the dietitians association. It's got to be, as a health consumer, we've got to be accountable for our own health and well-being, right? But to do that, we need to be educated. We need to be aware. Otherwise, how do we know what to do?
Well, the good thing, the groundswell is happening, and patients are going to their GPs and saying, you know, I've heard about this. Unfortunately, still to this day, you know, GPs often sort of poo-poo it, and which is disturbing in itself. So clearly, a lot of GPs aren't aware, or I mean, quite simply, you know, it does take more time and effort than writing a script for metformin or for insulin to actually spend the time to discuss these dietary issues. It does take time, and I think that's why the GPs need assistance. They need assistance in their education at medical school. They need assistance so that they have the time and perhaps the financial incentive to actually spend that time with the patients to give them advice. Also, nutritionists such as yourself, health coaches, dietitians, we all need assistance to be able to give that time and energy to our patients. But the patients also need assistance. As you say, having an environment that's protective for them, that's nurturing for them, but also for patients. And if we know and we realize that type 2 diabetes is more prevalent in lower socioeconomic areas, that we have subsidization of healthier foods in some of those areas, particularly for patients with metabolic syndrome, with pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes. And you know, this is just some of the assistance strategies that can be employed in this process. So awareness, accountability, assistance are just three overarching things which we need in order to have action, which is the big one. Action is what we need to actually. I've just come up with a tagline of type 2 free by 33. So we want to be type 2 diabetes free in Australia, no new cases by the year 2033. I think that would be a great thing to aim for.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. You know, it's my daughter, she's 8, and she always comes up with these little catchphrases, especially when we're in the car, right? Because she's not allowed to use devices in the car. She's got to learn to stare out the window and think, right? So she says to me, Dad, I just thought of something, and I'm driving. I go, what's that, sweetie? And she says, hashtag, because she's 8 and, you know, everything's about hashtags apparently. Hashtag eat healthy, live wealthy. And I said, what does that mean, sweetie? And she goes, well, it costs a lot of money to be sick, doesn't it, Dad? Right. So I think that needs to be like, this economic framework really needs to be, you know, ferreted out, really nutted out appropriately. People need to be fully aware of what it's actually costing us, not just economically, but in our experience of life and our years of health before that decline in our old age, and then what that is like in terms of quality of life. So you've had a platform during a tough year when the world shut down, and that I can imagine that would have been bloody frustrating, right? And you finally got this opportunity to have your voice heard, and then everyone was like locked away. But the message that you had to share, it couldn't have been more important during, you know, what we're going through right now. And now there's a new Australian of the Year. Your time with that title has passed, but now what? What are the actions that you're kind of designing and creating for yourself moving forward?
Sure. And I think I actually had quite a successful year last year. And as you say, the pandemic is absolutely the time to refocus our attention on our own health and particularly on our metabolic health, because if you have a chronic disease such as type 2 diabetes, you're 12 times more likely to die from COVID-19. People with uncontrolled diabetes are 10 times more likely to die from COVID-19. So it's absolutely critical that we're focusing our attention on our health at this time. So last year, I had a couple of wins. I was frustrated. I wanted to have an awareness raising program on free-to-air TV, and I'd come up with a number of commercials that I was working with a creative on, and that I'm still hoping to get out this year. So there's things I've been working on. I did lobby a number of supermarkets and stores to remove sugary products from checkout counters. Australia Post has now removed sugary products from over 700 of their corporate stores, so that was a win.
Oh, wow, well done.
One of the Foodland groups here in South Australia have removed sugary products from their checkout counters. Unfortunately, a number of the other big ones, no incentive whatsoever. I think ultimately this might need to be mandated. I was on the expert advisory group for the National Diabetes Strategy document, the refresh of that document, and I was the only one of the 25 odd people on that committee that actually brought up remission of type 2 diabetes. I said, why is this not in this document? So we now have this in the document, which is going to be released.
That alone is such a big deal, because the resignation, once someone is diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, everywhere you read, it says it's a progressive disease, which means it's just going to continually get worse. And at best, we'll try and make sure you have a somewhat normal quality of life whilst you've got this devastating disease as best we can, but don't expect too much. And then you come along and you say, no, this can be put into remission, and then now that's documented. Exactly. That's a big deal. That's hope for patients now.
There has to be hope for patients. I mean, when you go to the type 2 diabetes page of all the diabetes associations around the country, they've all got progressive. Diabetes Australia has the word progressive 5 times, and the other ones have all got it at least twice. And I've written to all of these associations now, and they're all coming back saying, yes, we're going to reword and maybe not remove the word progressive, but the fact that it may be progressive in some rather than it is a progressive condition. So that's another win. I think there is movement here. There is things happening, and I am wanting to create an entity, which I'm working on at the moment, to really focus on those 3 overarching aims: the awareness, accountability, assistance factor. Another thing that we need is research into nutrition science. It's so conflicted by industry influence. We need independent research, which is not conflicted by industry. We need, let's say, government-funded or philanthropically funded research, which is not dependent on industry funding, because we know when industry funds a study, it's 8 times more likely to show a result that's favourable to that industry. Yes. So this is a huge area, Dean. And so what I'm wanting to create going forward now is, as I say, an entity, whether that's an institute or a movement, that we can actually allow all of these things to happen. And as you say, the groundswell has got to come from below. Patients are now reaching out to their doctors, and this is it's just going to build. It is now acceptable. Having this dietary approach is in the National Diabetes Strategy. We need to get it. It's in the Diabetes Association websites now. There's often pages dedicated to a low carb or a very low calorie dietary approach. So it's starting to happen, and I'm positive that we'll see the change coming. But it's going to take many years to reverse some of these, particularly the predatory marketing tactics of industry. And you know, the industry is going to have to pivot, and they're going to have to be innovative. And we saw it with the tobacco industry. There was an uproar when the tobacco farmers had to when cigarette smoking was, all of the taxing and all of the things that happened to discourage the smoking of cigarettes. So the tobacco farmers were up in arms. We saw it recently with the citrus growers up in arms, the fact that orange juice was downgraded to 2 stars. Yes, okay, but what happens now in the tobacco farming areas? They're growing avocado, healthy fats, and actually making more money as a result. So, you know, human beings are very innovative, and this is the time we need to innovate. We need to stop poisoning people with heavily sugared, ultra-processed food, which are making us sicker and fatter.
Well, you know, people will only act if it occurs as possible. And, you know, on behalf of everyone whose lives are going to impact, and for those who have lost theirs, you know, a dear friend of mine, Pepe, a number of years ago, he and I were working up this kind of bio-entrepreneurial endeavor that I've continued with. But unfortunately, Pepe was diabetic. He'd lost his left leg just below the knee. He had a non-healing wound on his right foot. On that foot, he'd lost 3 of his toes. His kidneys were gone. He was on dialysis 3 times a week for 5 hours at a time. He did have a bout where he lost his eyesight, somehow miraculously regained his eyesight and was able to drive again after a year of getting his eyesight back. But he eventually had a series of heart attacks and passed away. You know, one of the things that he said to me.
That's right.
because I was working up a project where type 2 diabetes in the South Pacific is just rampant, right? So I went to Fiji, I met with the government a couple of times, and the dean of the Faculty of Medicine at Fiji National University. I had this approach where we could potentially salvage the limbs of these type 2 diabetic patients, because Fiji has the highest rate of diabetes-related amputations in the world, 1 every 12 hours.
We're having some technical issues here, Dean. It seems to have seized up, unfortunately.
Oh, is that better? Is it improved?
It's okay now, but I think
okay, good. It went a little bit unstable, I think. But yeah, so I was saying that Fiji's got the highest rate of diabetes-related amputations anywhere in the world, and I said to my friend Pepe, I said, you know, we're gonna treat this. We're gonna revascularize your limb with stem cells, and we can do all this sort of stuff. And he goes, Dean, that's all great, but you know what I'd love? Can you give me an erection? I haven't had one for 3 years. He said, if you can give me an erection, that would be life-changing for me.
I love you forever, yeah.
And I said, dude, you're talking to the wrong person. Speak to your missus. But anyway, I shared that.
Impotence is one of the complications of type 2 diabetes.
Absolutely, absolutely. You lose everything. And I shared that at his funeral. So on behalf of Pepe and every other person with diabetes, pre-diabetes, just really thank you for leading the charge and dealing with yourself and providing that leadership for, you know, everyone else that saw a possibility, but they didn't know how to band together. We didn't know how to support each other. And it's like, how can we continue to contribute and make a difference to the people of Australia? So really thank you for your time today. Can't wait to do another one of these chats in the future. And, you know, hand on heart, you have my commitment. Look forward to working with you as time moves on.
Thank you, Dean. And thanks for all you're doing. You're doing an amazing job. And I've seen some of the results of your work you're doing with your patients, and it's extraordinary. So congratulations to you too. Thanks for chatting with me this morning. I really enjoyed it.
Wonderful. Awesome. Thanks, James.